Good morning. So the first time that I ever preached a sermon, I used what I thought at the time was a very simple text from the book of Job. The passage themed around the importance of the practice lament can have in processing grief. And being the planner that I was and still currently am, I had planned and begun writing this first sermon of mine for 6 months. I knew I had a story I felt called to share corporately with my congregation at the time. So in June of that year, I picked November 13th to preach and began the work of picking the exact scripture from Job, interpreting it, working exegetically with the text, and crafting my own spoken lament within this sermon. I was grieving in June, and I was still grieving in November as I felt this fire in my belly to do something about it. What I had begun processing 6 months prior to this initial sermon was working through the process of the embodiment of a monumentous ball of grief for experiences that had begun to happen in my life 4 years prior. The summer after my junior year of college, I had my first experience with the dark night of the soul. A dark night of the soul is often a difficult period of transformation for an individual. During this dark night, one is often much more engulfed in the pain within and around them, and oftentimes goes through these dark nights alone, or at least feeling like they are alone. The process of transformation happens during these dark nights as an individual gains a deeper understanding of their life and their identity and how that fits into their perception of the world. It can be life-changing, and it can also be draining and isolating and filled with grief. My dark night of the soul was a time in my life where my sense of belonging was missing and a time where I could not find God, no matter how hard I searched. That summer in college, I was living in a house with 6 other people, and I'd never felt more alone than I did during those few months together. I experienced pain and loss multiple times. But during those months, I also learned about the healing powers of movement. So for the first time in my life, I put my running shoes on with my own free will, and I ran the trails around Bethel College. I ran those trails every single day that summer. I ran until I cried, and when I stopped crying, I ran again. I didn't realize it at the time, but my body was instinctively doing everything in its power to expel the grief from within my body. When my tears stopped flowing, my body found other ways to continue to expel the sadness that it was holding on to. I completed the entire insanity workout program. I danced in every single room in that house that I lived in. And I walked and ran as many trails as I could in Kansas and Colorado. At the time, I was a body, trying to evoke emotions to heal from pain that showed up in full force unexpectedly. And once the tears stopped and I could no longer feel those emotions, I assumed that I was healed. But unfortunately, I've learned that my grief doesn't work that way. Instead, I think that my body was so tired from expelling this grief that it stuffed those emotions deep down inside of me. I look back now and wonder if it was my body tapping in for a respite. My body found places where those emotions could hide and rest for a bit, while we all took a collective breath together. Now, I have felt physical pain in many ways, in a broken ankle, a dislocated shoulder, when we stub a pinky toe on the coffee table leg. But grief has been the most painful experience that I've had to work through. And physically holding in this grief has caused pain to build up for me in 4 distinct places that have served as the home of my soul. There's a knot in my throat that contains my sobs, a pain in my aching heart that holds the loss, a churning ball of anxiety that is nestled right behind my diaphragm, and a circle of nausea that breathes in my belly. My body was physically suffering, expelling the grief that I felt that summer, and I didn't have the words to express the hurt for that for several years. There are lots of emotions that we feel in our life. The joys of laughing until the belly hurts, the pains of a broken heart aching within the confines of a chest, the fast pace the adrenaline of excitement gives the body when everything goes as planned, the stream of sadness that runs down our cheeks until only dehydration causes them to stop, the flutter of the heart when it is reawakened to a new love, the trembling of fear in the knees when being particularly vulnerable, or the constant ache of the head when life stresses are too much to carry. If you've noticed in these explanations of these emotions, they all contain physical aspects of how the body holds on to them or how the body releases them. It's much easier to let out a deep belly laugh at a funny joke than it is to let out a cry of anger when injustices are present. Or at least it is for me. It's much easier to hold on to the grief, anger, and sadness of emotions than to release them from within the internal confinements. So one of the reasons I have really enjoyed exploring the Psalms is the naming of and the embodiment of emotions. The Psalms have provided us avenues to express our joys, express our anger, express our sadness. Psalms oftentimes express the hard truths of what has happened and the sometimes starkly vulnerable thoughts of the psalmists. The Psalms are intimate conversations with God, expressing one's emotions and one's fears found within grief, fear, confusion, but also joy and praise. The lectionary text for this Sunday actually contained Psalm 33. It was a psalm of praise, but I wasn't feeling the praising words to go along with it right now. One thing I don't know if I've shared with you already is that I really like playing around with lamenting and laments. So I paged through the other Psalms until I landed on Psalm 42, one that maybe we know more of a song. I think it's a 90s praise song. In Psalm 42, there is a repetitive line, "Why, my soul, are you downcasted?" It emphasizes this mourning that has taken over the body, while the psalmist wants to remember and feel the hope that once was. Grief tends to do that, to take over the body, and all we want to do is rid ourselves of that painful feeling that it has immersed itself within us. One book that I found particularly helpful over the last several years in learning how to release these emotions of grief is called Helping Youth Grieve: The Good News of Biblical Lament by Bob Yoder. This book explains how the practice of lament gives you time and permission to vent your pent-up anger, your deep sadness, and your self-blame. You allow yourself to grieve in ways that leads to healing and renewal. As you pour out your grief, loss, pain, and anger in the presence of God, you discover that God hears your cries of anguish and comforts you. While you can't remove the storms, quiet the thunder, or stop the lightning from striking, you can trust that your tears be the raindrops that release the clouds, allowing rays of sunlight to shine through. Before catching a glimpse of the rainbow, though, you have to brace yourself for the raging storm within. This process, to me, is like the dark night of the soul. We have to go through this painful period of transformation and letting go to live into a new identity. We have to practice this lament, lamenting that anger that is present, and lamenting that hurt that is present, so that we can allow space for hope to be felt again. And I think that there are many ways we can do this lamenting. Maybe we are runners and hikers and find that walking and running miles upon miles of trails does the trick. Maybe we can scream into our pillows or while we're driving down a dirt road. Maybe we cry until there's no tears left to cry. Think about how you hold on to your emotions. Where do they sit in your body? And how do you release those emotions? Since that painful summer 7 years ago, I have learned how to cry again. I've learned how to laugh until my belly hurts again. And I've rediscovered the healing powers music can have in healing the hurt found within the hidden confines of my various jars of emotions. And I think learning how to lament is a big piece of those learnings. Our world has done a really good job at teaching us to bottle up our emotions, to not show our messy and painful inner thoughts, and to pretend that we're fine. But healing and living into our true selves comes from letting out that grief, so that we can make space to catch a glimpse of that rainbow that is yet to come.